I became a teacher because I wanted to save the world, one kid at a time. I know it sounds naive, but I believed it was possible because it happened to me. I grew up in a rough inner-city neighborhood with parents who were barely around. He was my teacher, Mr. Mayfield, who listened when I needed to talk, helped me get a scholarship to college, and even intervened on my behalf when I got in trouble with the law. He had been there for me, and now I wanted to be there for someone else. As soon as I got my teaching degree, I applied for a program that matched educators with schools in need. During the tense months I spent waiting for a placement, I imagined that I would be working in a school like the one I had graduated from. I figured my students would be like me, city kids with city problems, and a lifestyle that I was familiar with. When my letter finally arrived, I discovered that I had been assigned to a tiny Appalachian town called Deer Chase. Its population was less than 300, and according to the organization, most of my students would be bussed in from nearby hollers that were even more remote. I had never lived anywhere without public transportation, without 24-hour shops, without background noise and light pollution. I had received a letter along with my posting, one in which my future principal explained just how isolated Deer Chase really was. It was an hour to the nearest gas station, and even further to the nearest grocery store. In winter, snow piled up on the narrow, holler roads, making them impassable for weeks at a time. The creeks usually flooded in spring, and if I went out into the woods during summer, I would need to be on the lookout for sinkholes and rattlesnakes. The only piece of good news was that the school had a house for visiting teachers, so at least I would be living rent-free. The more I read about Deer Chase, the less I liked it. But I had made a commitment. I wasn't going to back out just because the location wasn't to my liking. Besides, I needed the work badly, and I'd heard rumors that the organization blacklisted any teacher who turned down a posting. As I packed for the 14-hour drive to Deer Chase, I told myself to look on the bright side. Maybe this was my chance for one last big adventure after college. For all I knew, I might be about to discover that I loved life in the country. My second-hand hatchback had over 250,000 miles on it, and I was more than a little worried that it wasn't going to survive the journey. In order to give my car a break, I decided to spend the night at a rest area halfway to my destination. I couldn't get over how exposed the place was. Those glaring overhead lights, the nearly empty parking lot, the rumbling trucks and shadowy figures going to and from the bathrooms. At one point, I thought for sure I heard something scraping against the door lock. But by the time I woke up and looked around, the source of the sound was gone. Had someone been trying to get inside my car? I gave up on sleep and began the second half of my journey while in the dark. Dawn was breaking by the time I took the highway exit toward Deer Chase. Not that the town appeared on any signs. I was grateful that I had written the directions down. My GPS service was spotty on the mountain roads, and after a while, all of those gloomy, forest-covered hills started to look the same. Maybe it was just the lack of sleep, but eventually I did end up getting a bit lost. I pulled into a gas station, the kind that also sold fishing bait and groceries, where I hoped I could get a little help. A dusty bell jingled above the door as I walked inside. The three old men at the counter might have been customers, employees, or lifelong friends. It was impossible to say which. They stopped talking and observed me carefully. I cleared my throat and asked if any of them knew the way to Blink Hollow Road. The three men exchanged a glance. Finally, one scratched his stubbly white beard and sighed. "You missed it a couple miles back. That road goes right down into the valley. The sign's overgrown, and the turn really sneaks up on you," he warned me. "You headed down there for the fishing?" The large, bald man in overalls beside him wanted to know. I shook my head. I had been about to tell the trio exactly who I was and what I was doing there, but the way they were questioning me put me on guard. The less these three knew, I figured, the better. I had just thanked them and turned to go when the third man shouted something after me. "Just don't stay down there for too long. You don't want to come back with a deer chase stare," he chuckled. It was apparently a joke, but the other two weren't laughing. The large, bald man leaned in close and whispered something. It seemed like he was telling him off. "You take care now," he warned me. "Make sure to be out of there before dark." Part of me wanted to ask what he meant. Another part suspected that the three of them were just messing with me. My shiny black shoes and polo shirt made it clear that I was an outsider, and it wasn't a stretch to imagine that all their talk about the deer chase stare and getting out of there before dark was just a prank invented by some bored old men. 10 minutes later, I was turning down Blink Hollow Road, even though I had nearly missed it for a second time. Hidden in the shadow of so many large trees, the steep, downhill route looked more like a cave than a road. Small, slow-flowing streams and narrow game trails crossed it at regular intervals. At times, I caught a glimpse of a rickety tobacco barn or junk-cluttered trailer through the trees, but even those looked abandoned. 20 minutes later, the valley finally opened up ahead of me, and I could finally see the town of Deer Chase. It was a cluster of weather-beaten brick buildings. A church, a general store, a mechanic's garage, and the school where I would be teaching. Apart from the rusty bridge that crossed the creek and a few houses, there didn't seem to be anything else in town. I drove through slowly, checking addresses in search of the place that the organization had rented for me. I was surprised and a little unnerved to find that the house was just a few doors down from the school. I knew how vindictive some students could be, and I would have preferred a little more separation between my work life and my private life. A slim, middle-aged man in a wicker hat sat on the porch across the street, smoking his pipe and watching my progress. So far, he was the only other person I'd seen in Deer Chase. I sighed and pulled up to the address I'd been given in the letter. The house was small and on the older side, but the wide windows and fresh white paint gave it an open, airy feel. Just as I'd been promised, the key was beneath the welcome mat. As I stooped down to retrieve it, I felt a presence behind me. The air suddenly smelled like cologne, hayseed, and tobacco. "You're the new blood, huh?" a hoarse voice announced. I turned. The middle-aged man from across the street was holding out his hand to me. "Don Frey, principal of Deerfield High. I'm the one who sent you that letter." I shook it. After so many hours in the car, my clothes were wrinkled, my shirt was half untucked, and my hair was a sweaty mess. It wasn't exactly the first impression I wanted to make, but Don Frey didn't seem to mind. "Long drive, huh?" was his only comment. Principal Frey immediately launched into a speech that he had obviously given before. One in which he explained that the school owned this property, that the custodian would take care of yard work and maintenance, but I was responsible for keeping the inside neat and tidy, and that it was important to keep the trash cans sealed to discourage wildlife from approaching the house. Until he mentioned it, I hadn't really noticed how the woods seemed to loom over my new home. Just about every residence in Deer Chase butted up against the forest-covered hills, with barely a tiny patch of grass to separate them from all those gnarled, grasping branches. I thought of bears, vultures, and rabid raccoons, then shuddered. Principal Frey chuckled. "You're from the city, right? For some reason, almost all the kids they send us are from the city. You'll learn to like it out here, though. Most everybody who comes renews their contract at least once or twice. But I'm sure you've already heard all that from Michelle." According to the organization, I should have received a video call in which my predecessor, Michelle Hardesty, told me about her experience in deer chase and offered some helpful tips and suggestions for teaching there. All I'd received so far, however, was a paragraph-long email. I'd written Michelle to schedule a call, but so far I'd heard nothing. I decided not to mention it to Principal Frey. I didn't want to get anyone in trouble. And besides, I was exhausted from the 2-day drive to deer chase. "I'm right across the way," Principal Frey reminded me. "So don't be a stranger, you hear?" With that, he clapped me on the back and left. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I still felt eyes on me from inside the dark windows of the surrounding houses while I unpacked. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. I needed to relax and give deer chase a chance. At dusk, there was a knock at the front door. I peered through the people, but couldn't see anyone. Only a large brown bag with a note stapled to it. The tension of being in an unfamiliar place made my mind race with nasty possibilities. What might be inside? Some stranger's shit? A dead animal? A severed human head? Or maybe something even worse? I bit my lip and opened the door. "Welcome to your new home," read the note, signed, "Your Neighbors." The bag contained a week's worth of groceries, several home-cooked meals, and a blackberry pie. Everything was delicious. It was enough to make me forget about the strange sounds of nighttime in the country, and I fell asleep almost as soon as I climbed into bed. The weeks before school started passed by in a blur. There may not have been many people in deer chase, but they all seemed to want to meet me at once. Cecil, the mechanic, came by to offer me a discount on an oil change. Reverend Witt from Deer Chase Baptist Church wanted to know if I'd been baptized. I was constantly bombarded with advice, gossip, invitations to dinner, and I still hadn't even prepared my first lesson. Under the circumstances, I guess it's no surprise that I overlooked some of the more unusual aspects of life in deer chase. Like how so many of the homes, including mine, seemed to have a path into the woods in their backyards. Or the total absence of teenagers on the streets. I knew that kids didn't spend as much time outside as they used to, and that deer chase had a tiny youth population. But I had still somehow expected to see a few of my soon-to-be students tossing a ball into a rusty hoop in front of the church, or sneaking puffs from a cigarette on the weathered wood steps of the general store. Tom Minton's Goods and Sundry read the rusty tin sign on the general store's roof, and it was the first place I went once the supplies from the gift bag began to run out. The shelves were stocked with everything from cans of beans to zip ties and romance novels. All of it was dusty and overpriced. I expected to find a bespectacled old man behind the counter. Instead, I discovered that the owner was a freckly redhead who looked to be right around my age. Tom Minton was my grandfather, she shrugged when I asked her about the sign. Her name was Ruth Minton, and she was one of the only people who hadn't come by to say hello with the rest of the casserole parade. She was reserved and tight-lipped when compared to the rest of them. She gave one-word answers to my questions, and usually hurried into the back of the store to avoid any attempt I made at conversation. At first, I thought she just didn't want to give me the wrong idea, considering that we were both young and single. But by the end of August, I had begun to suspect something darker was going on. Ruth went straight from the store to home, and never spoke to anyone in town if she could help it. It was almost like she was scared of them, although I couldn't see why. The locals had been nothing but kind to me since I'd arrived. The only thing that bothered me were the noises I sometimes heard at night. Principal Frey had warned me about animals trying to get into the trash, so I figured that was all it was. At first. Maybe it was just city boy skittishness, but whatever was out there sounded a lot bigger than some raccoon. It called to mind unsettlingly the little path that began in my backyard, the one that I still hadn't gotten around to fully exploring. If nobody was using it, it should have been a lot more overgrown, right? Work pushed those disquieting thoughts right from my mind. During the first week before school, I met my future coworkers and got my first look inside Deer Chase High School. Like the house I was staying in, its worn hallways and yellowed light fixtures were old but well kept. Most of my fellow teachers were locals who had moved back to the area after college. I didn't have much to add to their conversations about hunting or engine repair, but they did their best to include me anyway. Everything was going fine. Until September 1st. The arrival of those rumbling yellow school buses completely transformed Deer Chase High. Suddenly, students were everywhere, yelling, goofing around, greeting each other after the long summer vacation. I felt a little guilty. In the back of my mind, I had been expecting horror movie stereotypes. A bunch of creepy blonde kids who were all in some religious cult, or a classroom full of ignorant hicks. Instead, I found that teens in Deer Chase were just like the kids the whole world over. They even listened to some of the same music as my students back in the city. Most of them already knew who I was, and a few of the older students even stopped to greet me and asked what I thought of their town so far. After the first 15 minutes of class, I was brimming with confidence. This was going to be easier than I thought. I'll never forget what happened next. We were doing an icebreaker activity. The students were all up out of their seats, milling around the room. Derek, Reverend Witt's 17-year-old son, had just told a joke that had the whole class laughing, even me. And then suddenly, everyone froze. Most had stopped in uncomfortable positions, with hands thrown up in the air or leaning cross-legged on someone else's desk. A few had even been caught mid-clap. If it was some bizarre prank, however, it shouldn't have worked so seamlessly. At least one or two of the students should have giggled or wobbled in their awkward stances. But nobody did. I waved a hand in front of Derek's wide-eyed, grinning face. He didn't even blink. Some of their eyes were beginning to water. Saliva dribbled down from their open mouths, and the unnatural poses were causing some students' muscles to pulse beneath their skin like twitching worms. I was starting to get genuinely worried. I clapped, shouted, warned them to knock it off. All to no avail. I picked up the phone and dialed the principal's office. When I still hadn't gotten an answer after 10 rings, I stuck my head out into the hallway. The whole building, it seemed, had gone silent. Seconds ticked by. And then, without warning, life resumed. Hands clapped together. Conversations went on as though they'd never been interrupted at all. Principal Frey called back to ask what was wrong. Nothing, I said, but my eyes were fixed on the clock. 6 whole minutes had passed, but apparently I was the only one who noticed it. A hand on my shoulder made me jump. "You okay, Mr. B?" Derek asked. "You look a little wound up." This time, he wasn't smiling. "First date jitters, I guess," I teased. "You guys are just too much for me." Derek went back to the activity, apparently satisfied, but he whispered something to Susie, the tall ponytailed girl who sat beside him. When the bell rang to switch classes, both of them looked over their shoulders at me as they left. I couldn't read the expression on their faces. It seemed almost like suspicion, or fear. If the whole thing had just been a joke, then why did the two of them seem to be taking it so seriously? The remainder of my classes went fine, or would have if I hadn't been so shaken up. Fortunately, most of the students at Deer Chase High were just as friendly and welcoming as their parents. Even though I was distracted and unfocused, nobody gave me any real trouble. So why couldn't I escape the feeling that the whole school was observing me, waiting to see how I would react to this morning's events? It got worse as the day went on, and by last period I was scared of my own shadow. I jumped in my chair when Principal Frey came by to ask me how my first day had gone. As much as I longed to mention those missing 6 minutes, I didn't want to give the impression that the kids were already messing with me. It went great, I told him, and went back to preparing the following day's lesson. In my dreams that night, I was back in the classroom, trapped with those statue-still teenagers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The ticking of the clock felt as loud as a drum beat. This time, however, something was different. The students inched a little closer each time I blinked. The expressions on their faces, too, began to change. Instead of being locked in laughter, they twisted into something animalistic and hateful. Their hands lifted, as though they wanted to fling me to the floor and eat me alive. I tugged at the door handle, but it refused to open. The lights flickered, and then I woke up with a start. I lay in bed, watching the ceiling fan stir the muggy summer air and trying to sleep. I heard more of those noises outside. This time, there could be no doubt about it. What I was hearing were footsteps. Several sets of them. I rushed to the kitchen to turn on the backyard floodlights, but they didn't work. No matter how hard I squinted, all I could see through the windows was the pitch blackness of a moonless country night. I had problems sleeping for the next 2 weeks. Because I'd prepared everything well and the students were so easygoing, I was able to get through each day. But it was clear that I couldn't keep this up. The next Friday afternoon, I packed up my things right after last period and headed home for a well-deserved nap. Halfway across the street, however, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Where had all the shouts and conversation gone? The only noise left was the rumbling of school bus engines and the lonely bounce of an abandoned basketball. It was happening again. All of the teenagers in Deer Chase had suddenly frozen in place. I looked around desperately for another adult presence, if only to confirm that I wasn't crazy, and locked eyes with the nearest bus driver. To my surprise, she didn't look bothered at all by the phenomenon. She just drummed her long, crimson nails on the steering wheel impatiently, waiting for it to pass. I stuck my head through the open bus door and asked what was wrong. Wrong? She snorted. Don't know what you're talking about. I couldn't believe it. Weaving through the crowd of eerily unmoving students, I made my way to Principal Frey's office. If anybody could explain this, it was him. The student sprang back to life just as I was approaching his door. A football player shoulder-checked me and apologized. He seemed genuinely confused about how we had crashed into each other. They don't know, I realized. None of them are aware of what's happening to them. Or maybe not none of them. Principal Frey's door swung open just as I was arriving, and 2 students walked out. Derek Witt and Susie, the girl with the ponytail from my first period class. From the looks on all 3 of their faces, they had just been talking about me. Derek here was just telling me how great your first lesson was, Principal Frey told me, and he's not an easy young man to impress. I hadn't overheard much of their conversation, but it was enough to chill my blood. I caught the words, "Sure he noticed," and "happening more often." I stammered a thank you to Derek, but decided against mentioning the weird trance the students had just gone into. Whatever was happening here, Principal Frey was already aware of it. Maybe even a part of it. I went home, wrote yet another email to my predecessor Michelle, and collapsed into bed. The sun was setting when I woke up. There was still time, I realized, to ask one other person about the strangeness I'd witnessed. Ruth Minton at the general store. She was locking up when I approached, and my unexpected presence made her jump. "What do you want?" she inquired irritably. I asked if she'd known Michelle. "Yeah, I did," was all Ruth said, before stuffing her keys in her jacket pocket and stomping down the stairs. "Why did she leave?" I insisted. "I can't get her to call me or have a real conversation, no matter how hard I try." Ruth glared at me, as though that should have told me everything I needed to know. "Wait!" I shouted after her, but she was already gone, scurrying toward her beat-up truck like a hunted deer. As I walked back home, I caught a glimpse of a pipe smoldering in the gloom of the porch across the street. Principal Frey was watching us. On my last grocery run, I had picked up a light bulb for the backyard floodlight, but it still wasn't working. Cecil, the custodian, had been evasive about what the problem might be. It made me wonder whether maybe my lights had been tampered with on purpose. I found myself pacing from room to room, wondering what the hell these people were hiding. Was this what those old men at the gas station had meant when they talked about the deer chase stare? Last time, the sound of footsteps at night had coincided with the student's trance. If the pattern held, whatever had been passing through my backyard would be back tonight. There was a chance that I might be able to catch them in the act, if I was lucky. Giving up on sleep, I crept out the back screen door and squatted in the shadow of a magnolia tree near the path. The moon overhead was almost full, and I was confident that I would be able to see the trespassers without being seen myself. The only problem was the bugs. I had barely gotten into position when I felt something crawling down my cheek. I didn't see what it was before I swatted it away, but it had felt almost hand-sized. Next came the mosquitoes. The longer I sat there, the more of them closed in, as though they were having their last big feast before fall arrived. I was about to give up and go inside, when I spotted 5 dark shapes tiptoeing along the side of the house. One of them was Susie. She paused to check inside my bedroom window. I shivered, suddenly glad that I had left the bed messy enough so that it appeared someone was sleeping there. She gave the other 4 a thumbs-up sign, and the group made straight for the path. I recognized all of them as Deer Chase High School students. "Go inside and call the police," screamed the sensible side of my brain. "Tell them what?" replied the more daring half. "The only way you'll ever get to the bottom of this is if you follow them yourself." And that was exactly what I did. I had never imagined that my first teaching job would involve missing time or creeping through the woods by moonlight. And yet, here I was, getting further away from safety with each step. I thought of all the stories I'd heard of people getting lost for weeks, or dying of exposure in small, well-traveled parks, just because they had wandered a short distance off the trail. And Deer Chase was a lot more remote than any of those places. What if I got turned around in the dark? The students up ahead, at least, seemed confident that they knew the way. The branches cast inky black shadows on the pale dirt trail. The 5 teenagers walked quickly and in total silence. Wherever they were going, they were in a hurry to get there. They didn't look back once, not even after a twig snapped beneath my heel. The path wound up to a rocky ridge that offered a panoramic view of the whole valley, then descended steeply into a narrow gully. It joined up with other trails along the way. Some of them even had handholds worn into the stone, as though they'd been used for generations. All of the paths led downward. The humid air was full of crogfroaks and the whir of insects. The ground beneath my feet slowly transformed into slick muck. The vegetation was thicker down here, with more grasping limbs and gnarled roots to trip over, and the mosquitoes were worse than ever. What the hell could a group of teenagers want with a place like this? Up ahead, the foliage finally opened up, revealing a slime-covered pond with a dead tree at its edge. Fireflies, moths, and other bugs I couldn't identify fluttered above the water. The group made directly for the tree, then halted at the sound of something crashing through the undergrowth. Something huge. The largest stag I'd ever seen was barreling toward the 5 teens, swinging its crown of antlers from side to side like a deadly pendulum. Its mouth frothed. Its eyes were wide and rolling. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but the stag changed directions, making for the tree instead. It scraped its body against the bark for several minutes, then charged off as quickly as it had come. The group of teens exchanged a glance, but they didn't seem frightened or even surprised. Well, except for one of them. Beside Susie stood a shorter girl who I thought I recognized. She was a freshman, and Susie's sister. She clung to her older sibling's hand as though she might fall off the earth if she let go. I inched nearer. "You ready, Katie?" Susie whispered. "As I'll ever be," Katie replied. Her braces flashed in the moonlight as she gave the group a nervous little smile. "Go on," a broad-shouldered boy from the Deer Chase High football team told her. "You know what to do. It's not scary." The fear on Katie's face said otherwise. With Susie and the others forming a sort of honor guard around her, she approached the dead tree. There was no cover between the edge of the woods and the murky shore of the pond, but I was going to have to get even closer if I wanted to see what they were up to. I took a deep breath and tiptoed out into the moonlight. All it would take now was one of them turning around. I was totally exposed. I didn't dare breathe again until I was hidden by the reeds at the pond's edge. Katie ran her fingers across the gnarled wood. She seemed to be trying to catch something smaller than a dime that emitted a faint greenish light. There were dozens of them scurrying across the tree. To me, they looked a lot like glow-in-the-dark ticks. Katie trapped one gently between her fingers and inspected it in the moonlight. "The back of the neck's the best place," Susie explained to her little sister. Katie, still hesitant, followed her advice. Seconds later, Katie's face contorted with pain, and then she giggled. "See?" Susie squeezed her shoulder. "Not any worse than ripping a band-aid off. It might take a minute or two for it to kick in, though." The others were already combing the tree for their own brightly colored bugs. The football player cupped one gently between his hands before holding it against his wrist. Another boy passed one to Susie, who accepted it gratefully. The 5 of them stood on the edge of the moonlit pond, their unmoving, black silhouettes looking like some sort of bizarre, surrealist sculpture. Finally, the football player's shoulders began to shake. He clapped his hands together, threw his head back, and laughed. He took off running through the woods, careless of any path, almost like the stag we'd seen a few minutes before. The others went after him, dancing, twirling, and gibbering like they'd lost their minds. Once I was sure they were gone, I walked up to the dead tree myself. There were still several of those glowing, tick-like insects skittering around, but I wasn't planning to pick one up myself. Not without gloves, anyway. This, I thought, must be the truth behind the so-called deer chase stare. The kids in town were all getting high on the venom of these weird little bugs. Their trances, or whatever they were just a side effect. I already had a plan in mind. I would catch a few of the insects in a jar and take them to a buddy of mine at the state university, a guy who was getting his PhD in entomology. Even if he wasn't able to explain what was happening to the teenagers in Deer Chase, he would surely know someone who could. Little by little, life and sound returned to the pond. Frogs croaked, cicadas whirred, a fat possum blinked down at me from a limb overhead. It would have been a picturesque late-night scene, if it wasn't for the secret that I now knew. I looked back up the path with a sinking feeling, wishing that I had turned around from time to time to see what the trail looked like from the other direction. Apart from a few tense moments when the path was hidden by rotting leaves or scrambled over stone, however, I was able to follow it back with no problems. Just how often did the local teenagers come down to this place, and others like it? I thought back to what Derek had said in Principal Frey's office about those freakish, frozen-in-time moments happening more often. What if the trances weren't a side effect at all? What if they were a withdrawal symptom? The thought of generation after generation creeping down here to take their first hit, only to become dependent on some insect's venom, it made my skin crawl just thinking about it. One thing was for sure, I couldn't trust Principal Frey, or any of the other local authorities, with what I'd discovered. I had to get this information to somebody far away from Deer Chase. When I finally got back, the digital clock in the kitchen read 3:03 a.m. The house, at least, was undisturbed, and the lights were out in the homes across the street. Nobody had noticed my absence. Or at least, I hope not. I showered away the grime of the woods off my skin and threw myself into bed, exhausted. The next Monday, I kept an eye out for the group that I'd seen in the woods. I had expected to find them gaunt and hollow-eyed, their bodies still reeling from that insane dance through the forest. But apart from a few scratches, all 5 looked happy and healthy. They looked better, in fact, than any teenagers I'd ever seen. When I'd first started teaching in Deer Chase, the cheerful, easygoing attitude of the students had been a relief. Now, it suddenly seemed sinister. After work, I went home and made a shopping list. One that included glass jars and thick rubber gloves. I was just about to head out the door when I spotted a broad-brimmed straw hat bobbing up and down on the other side of my living room window. Principal Frey? What was he doing back on my porch? Fully aware that there was no way to get to my car without being seen, I stepped outside and greeted him. The school principal was seated in my front porch rocker, refilling his pipe and looking out over the town like he owned the place. And maybe, in a certain sense, he did. "Been meaning to tell you," he smiled apologetically. "Your front tires are starting to look a little low." I glanced over his shoulder at my hatchback. The tires weren't just low, they were flat. "Don't worry," Principal Frey reassured me when he saw the look of horror on my face. "I already talked to Cecil. He should have some replacements for you in a week or 2, tops." He paused to light his pipe, then went on. "The school district will pick up the bill. See, we know how hard it must be for you, moving to a place like this where you might run into all sorts of unexpected things. But you'll also find that around here, we take care of our own, no matter what." I wasn't sure whether it was a veiled threat or whether Principal Frey was just being neighborly, but I was pretty confident that I hadn't run over anything sharp recently. The sabotage was probably deliberate, which meant I'd have to find another way to get the proof of what I found out of Deer Chase. My gaze drifted to the big, rusty tin sign in the middle of town, the one that read, Tom Minton's Goods and Sundry. I told Principal Frey that we'd talk more later. Right now, I needed to pick something up at the general store. "I've got to talk to you," I shouted to Ruth, before she could run into the back of the store like usual. She stood up from the shelves she was stocking and dusted off her hands on her jeans. It seemed like she already knew what was coming. I was going to take a chance. If I was wrong, it might be the last thing I ever did. "You're different from everybody else in Deer Chase," I said, "and I think I know why." Ruth froze. For an awful second, I was afraid it was the Deer Chase stare all over again. Then I realized how long she must have been waiting for someone to say those words. How long she must have been waiting to share her story with someone she could trust. "My grandfather Tom was a God-fearing man," Ruth stammered. "Not like that hypocrite Reverend Witt and his son Derek. Tom Minton made our whole family promise that we wouldn't go out into the woods at night along with the rest of them. And as you can imagine, that didn't make us very popular. My ma and sisters all left town, but not me. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. After what happened to Michelle, though..." I glanced nervously toward the door. Cecil the mechanic and his son, the football player who I'd seen in the woods, were standing in front of the garage across the street. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but then again, maybe not. I asked Ruth what she meant about Michelle. She admitted that she didn't have any evidence, only suspicions, and the confidence that Michelle had been her friend. She never would have left without telling her. Yet, one day, toward the end of the past school year, my predecessor had just vanished. Her car was gone, the house was empty, and all of its lights had been turned off. Ruth had gone so far as to message the social media accounts of Michelle's parents, asking for news about their daughter. They said they heard from her about once a week, and that she'd taken a different remote teaching job on the other side of the country. Everybody's saying they've heard from her, but it's all through email. No one's seen Michelle or heard her voice in months. And those emails, they don't sound like the bubbly West Coast gal I used to know. They sound like someone pretending to be Michelle. And you know the worst part? Right before she disappeared, Michelle was doing just what you're doing now. Standing here asking for a ride out of town. Ruth drew in a long, ragged breath. "Go pack. I'll pick you up in 15 minutes. I checked outside again. Cecile and his son were gone. I forced myself to walk rather than run back to the house. No one was on the streets of Deer Chase, but that didn't mean no one was watching. It was a hot, humid afternoon, and by the time I reached the porch, I was thinking more about a glass of cold water and what I was planning to stuff into my suitcase than the dangers of Deer Chase. I stepped inside, locked the door behind me, and was just turning toward the kitchen when I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cecile and his son. I barely had time to think of the name before the pair slammed me against the floor. A muscly knee pressed into my spine. My arms were pinned. "This house is property of the school," Principal Frey said. "And so, of course, I've got a spare key." He stood in the shadows of the room, and he wasn't alone. Susie and her sister Katie were at his side. Susie held a small glass jar that contained a few scurrying insects I recognized. Grunting from the pain, I asked him how he'd known. Your shoes, Principal Frey explained. There aren't many places around here where you find that sort of thick, black mud. And all of them are home to our little friends here. Susie approached with the jar. Her sister carefully unscrewed it. Principal Frey snapped on one of his wife's gardening gloves and reached inside. One of these little fellas could bite me right now. I wouldn't get much more than a rash. Some funny dreams. Maybe a day or two of fever. I'm too old, see? A young person like you, on the other hand, the effect gets weaker after the age of 20 or so. But I think you're still young enough to appreciate what they can do. I thrashed and kicked, but Cecile and his son were both twice my size. I couldn't see what was happening, but I could sense the tiny legs creeping across the back of my neck. Just as I was praying that it wouldn't bite, I felt a twinge of pain just above my right shoulder. Not any worse than ripping off a Band-Aid, Susie had said. And it was true. Moments later, the area around the bite began to feel hot. My stomach rolled, as though I'd just taken a plunge on a roller coaster. And then that tiny bug's venom finally took effect. My mentor, Mr. Macefield, had kept me away from hard drugs, but he couldn't change the neighborhood I grew up in. I tried a few things before. This stuff was better than any of them. It was better than making love, better than hearing a judge say the words, "not guilty," better than the happiest moments of my life. Space became sound, sound became color, and the whole thing blended into a glorious symphony that felt like it would never end. When I came back to my senses, the sun had set and the temperature was dropping. I was somewhere on the 2-lane road outside of Deer Chase. My legs ached from all the running, or maybe dancing, that I'd been doing during the past several hours. A truck rumbled up behind me. It might even have been there all along. Reverend Witt was driving. Derek was in the back seat, and Principal Frey was riding shotgun. He stuck his head out the window. And just think, he chuckled, that's not even a tenth of what you would have felt if you were 16. As you probably noticed, Principal Frey went on, there aren't many good jobs around here. There's no industry, no culture, no tourist attractions. Our little tradition is the one thing we've got going for us, and we'll defend it to the death if need be. I wiped drool from my mouth with the back of my hand. I stared hungrily at the pickup. I knew I should have been screaming about how wrong all of this was, but all I could think of was how badly I wanted more. Reverend Witt and Principal Frey winked at each other and exchanged a knowing glance. Don't worry, son, the Reverend smiled, holding up Susie's little glass jar. All things come in God's good time. On the drive back to the house, Principal Frey explained his terms. For the duration of my contract, I was forbidden from leaving Deer Chase without being accompanied by either Reverend Witt, Cecil, or himself. The same went for calls and messages exchanged with anyone outside of town. In return, I would receive a dose of chase tick venom as often as I could safely receive it. The seasons changed. I grew accustomed to how my students would sometimes stop mid-step or mid-sentence, to how their eyes would glaze over as they glared intently at something I couldn't see. Later, I began to notice that I was missing time myself. I took it in stride, knowing that in Deer Chase, this was normal. I knew that the community would look out for me, and so they did. A for sale sign eventually popped up in the dusty window of Tom Minton's Goods and Sundry. Everyone told me that Ruth had finally given up and moved away. Eventually, I even managed to convince myself that it was true. I renewed my contract, then renewed it again. By the end of my 3rd year, I was 25, and the chase tick venom barely did anything for me anymore. Just as Principal Frey had said, for older adults, all it offered was a rash, a fever, and some intense dreams during the following night. It was time to move on. After I'd said my goodbyes to my friends in Deer Chase, I shook Principal Frey's hand, silently reaffirming my promise to never mention the town's strange secret to anyone. I continued my career as a teacher, and my performance reviews were glowing. Although, they did mention how I seemed to space out from time to time. Things might have gone on like that forever, if it wasn't for the severe flooding in the Deer Chase area last spring. The rising water left behind the remains of a pickup truck that had been dumped into the creek, as well as the corpse of a young woman with her hands cuffed to its steering wheel, Ruth Minton. The discovery prompted state police to dredge the rest of the creek, where Michelle Hardesty was finally found. Her body had been weighted down by chains and mummified with electrical tape. Most disturbing of all, her parents had received an email from her just a few days prior. Police traced its transmission to a fast food joint on the same exit I'd taken to reach Deer Chase, one that offered free Wi-Fi. I wasn't sure what stung more, the knowledge that the people of Deer Chase had hidden the truth from me, or the knowledge that I'd been so desperate for their drug that I'd believed such flimsy lies. I went to the state police with everything I had, but I had forgotten how crazy my story would sound to anyone who hadn't lived it. The agent I spoke to promised that they would look into it. It was months before a pair of officers finally investigated the trail behind the teacher's house. Of course, since they went during the day, they found nothing to corroborate my testimony. The only result of their visit was that the people of Deer Chase now knew that I had betrayed their secret. I told myself that I was safe in the city, that none of my old neighbors would search me out and drive so far just for a broken promise. Of course, that was before last night, when I found a tiny, glowing tick on my pillow. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.